I think now we need to go here. Yeah.
Okay.
So let's start again with our keynote speaker. It's a real pleasure to introduce everybody to Rolf Amdam. I think Carlos mentioned some part of your career, but you are professor, emeritus professor right now, is that correct? In the BU Business School, and you were previously Associate Dean of Executive Master of Management Programs, and from 2011 2014, you were the Dean of the Executive Programs. You have a PhD degree from University of Oslo, based on the study of the development of business education in Norway. So you have been working on this topic for many years. You are an expert, key figure in this field. So Rolf is, I was a friend of Los Andes University. The second time that Rolf visited us, he was a former Corona, I think, visitors a few years ago. And it's a pleasure to have you here again to talk with us about the different perception of management, the global north meets the global south. So thank you very much for being here and accept our invitation to join the event.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea. I'm happy to be here. And the topic I've then decided to talk about is this, what I call the different perception of management in the global north and the global south. And I hope I can share something. I have to say that I have a lot of respect for those who know a lot about Latin America. I do not speak Spanish. I have done some research on Latin America from the American archives, and I've been so lucky to cooperate with Andrea and with Carlos in writing this up, and I learned a lot, and I hope to learn more also today. I think I would start with a quote that I found in one of those reports and journals on management, Latin American management. And this is from a journal or a paper by Eugene McCann in the Academy of Management Journal in 1964. He says something like that scientific methods is the most used of any of the tools of US management. Lack of utilization of such concept undoubtedly hampers Latin American decision makers. The effective utilization of scientific methods requires patient, careful, orderly thinking, and the ability to see reality objectively. The Latin American, however, tends to be impatient, impulsive, emotional, and to disregard objectivity. It may be true, or it may not be true. I'm not sure. I'm not say anything with that, but that says something about there is a rich tradition in also management literature about characterize your own management style, your own management theory, your own management practices with others, and as this is typical for the 60s. So what I then want to talk about and what I want to focus on today is then to talk about different forms of meeting points between management in the global north and in the global south. And I mean meetings is places, or not only places, but also discussions where different perceptions meet and are confronted. This basically meetings in related to theories and ideas, and my things is when you meet and are in a way express these ideas, is much easier to understand what are the differences. And this meeting places take place in physical meetings, but also in discourses within discipline and so on and so on. So when I'm talking about management here, I'm basically talking about management as a concept, as theories and ideas, and not about management as practice, which is, of course, also extremely important, but it's outside the topic today. And I will have basically an historical approach. I know there is a very important debate in management and organization studies, journals on these topics, and I'll reflect a little bit of that, but my focus today is basically from more in the historian's perspective. So what I plan then to do is then to discuss or present some ideas related to 7 topics that are relevant for this concept or this meeting place approach. And then I will end by discussing some implications for research and hear your reaction to that. So, and I will basically use some examples from Latin America that I come across, but I will also use some examples from India, which is another country in the global south, because I have now started to do some research on how management education was introduced and in India, both from the American Business School sites, but also from the ILO, which is a project that we have with Andrea here. So I will then start with going back to a meeting that the ILO had in 1965. And the ILO is, as you know, the International Labour Organization. They were concerned with kind of welfare or labours from the middle periods. And after the Second World War, they strengthened their work on productivity. But they said that because if we increase productivity, that it will improve the conditions for the labour workforce. And within that concept, within their work on productivity, the idea of also introducing work on development, the management concepts in firm management development program emerged. And then ILO in 1958 decided to have a special project on introducing management development programs in developing countries so that you could develop good managers at companies. And this meeting here in 65 best summarized this project. And it was a meeting of experts from 20 to 30 countries, experts who have been involved in ILO's work, but also experts that were experts on cultures and structural things, and both from their own country and also from other countries. And this meeting should then discuss what are then the main kind of social and cultural differences between the countries, and what is then the implication for how to develop management, education, and training in different countries. And that's what I have here, two quotes. And the first quote, and the first thing is from the official conclusion from this meeting. And this conclusion should summarize what all these 16 experts have reported from different countries. And the conclusion said that, well, if we talk about the management development program that ILO has in the developing countries, they didn't question at all the robustness and relevance of the management message that came from the ILO or from the north, we could say. Well, they accepted that Western expert has to be trained to do the job, and they also had to said that they need them to understand the cultural difference to be trained to be able to be operate in those countries. But they didn't question the fact that the structure and idea of the management development programs that have been developed and basically from the headquarters in Geneva, they didn't question that, but said that that could be used. It's more a kind of application to different kind of traditions. But so that's one view. But if we then go to the different reports and take this, for instance, report from India, which was expressed by Professor Kamala Chaudhary, she was a very important person in India. She was one of the founding persons in the new business schools in Ahmedabad, the Indian Institute of Management Association, established in 1961. She had studied in the US. She had a PhD from Michigan University. And she was active in negotiation with Harvard Business School, which was a kind of key supporter of the new business school in Ahmedabad and acted as an intermediary in that process. So she knew what she was talking about, and she was very well trained. She said something else in her report, because that she underlined the fact that this kind of first, she mentioned a lot of differences and a lot of uniqueness in the Indian cultural system. And this was things that were related to the fact that India had something called the management agent system, was a special group of management persons that worked on the behavior of the British. They had another concept of authority within the family perspective, and the ritualism was very important in India, she said. And these things are so important that it's not the question about adjusting to this. It's more question of taking these differences as a starting point, and the development programs has to be built on that respect. So in my understanding, these two reports here, that was expressed seemingly in the atmosphere of harmony and good discussion. They express two different narratives about global north and global, how the global north and the global south perceive differences. One saying that the global north idea is correct, they have to be adjusted. The other say that, well, we have to start with what is typical for different countries and then develop the programs. This is kind of also an argument for why this kind of meeting point perspective could then be of interest. And as a consequence of that, Chowdhury defended very, very strongly in the debate with Harvard Business Schools, saying that our way of constructing the executive program in India is a bit different from what is Harvard done, in the way that we need to adjust them more to middle management, we need to adjust them more to organizational culture and so on, without going into detail to that. Then, may that make some reflection on this global south and global north perspective. I see that this global south perspective has become more and more important, and I'm very fascinating about this stream of literature. To me, it's a question partly as a standard. It's partly about the fact that phenomena in the global south are not so well studied, and I think we see that there is a lot of interesting information coming up today that you could support to that. But there's also an argument saying that it's not only the fact that it's not so much studied, but it's also that there are processes in here in the global south that are in a way need to come up to understand the real dynamics in some kind of process. For instance, expressed in an article by Vanderleer and his colleague, or you colleague, if you are there, on the business schools in Brazil. And they show that then we come to the case in business schools in Brazil, there was a lot of local initiative, local thoughts, and these were local efforts to overcome the constraints of being a subordinate position. At the same time, I don't see it as a kind of conflict with the kind of Americanization, because I think the Americanization is very fruitful in some cases, meaning talking about we had a paper on Peru here today, and the establishment of ISAN, the business school in ISAN, is, in my view, typical expression of Americanization, because it was something that was constructed or driven by American forces, but in other cases not so relevant. And in some places, it also fits to the topic of decolonization. For instance, India, where you have both a decolonization process, you have strong Americans, MIT, Harvard, Ford Foundation, etc., that in a way were acting in those countries. But the fact is that I see this kind of global south and global north as a kind of contextual issue that may vary from one place to another place. And this debate, in a way, has some kind of parallel voices in other kind of literature. I can mention two examples here. One example is by Anne Chui, who was the first editor of this Management and Organizational Review, a very good journal that specializes on emerging economies. And in one of the first editorial articles in that journal, when it was launched in 2007, she argued for a kind of radical change in the research strategy. Said that if you're going to understand, well, she was then talking about emerging economies, we can't replicate the concepts, but we need to create new concepts to understand, to identify phenomena. She also said we can not only use old theories and replicate that, but we need to create new theories. And she said in the countries where there are lack of archives, or difficult to make surveys, people may not answer honestly, and all these things, we may be creative and be innovative to create new research methodology. In business history, we have a very good case with a paper that Carlos Davila and Jeffrey Jones and Olsen wrote in Business History some years ago about business history, how they should use alternative concepts when it comes to the emerging economy. So it's a very, very important and good debate. So let me then come back to this my seven key points here. And the third key point is then thinking that when talking about the meeting between global south and the global south and global north, there are many global north and many global south. I'm not going to talk about the many global south because you are expert at that, but I will say something about the global north principle is the same. But before that, I would say that in general, we think that the main tendency, which I accept, is that when it comes to management, the discussion and the discourse and the meeting points between managers in the 50s and 60s and 70s, which is my focus, so is the understanding that the global north is the force that should guide the global south out of underdevelopment. That was the idea. Or it is so. That's my because if we then go to some examples here, but I mean the main trend is of course that this is a kind of one-way transfer, attempt to one-way transfer. But if we then go to this kind of to one specific case, and let's say that if we go to the establishment of the business school in CAI in Central America in the beginning of in 60s, which was a strong where our business school played a very, very important role in training, educating, and staffing this business school, typically as a transfer of knowledge. But the dean of the Harvard Business School, Dean Baker, said that in addition, there was another motive by being involved in that. And that motive is that these international activities will result in returning knowledge to the school about a wide range of management problems. So there was quite a lot of intention to get something back. And I can also mention that I have, together with two colleagues from BI, my own institution, just published a paper in the Journal of International Business Studies on the creation of international business and academic discipline, where we had gone through a lot of international cases that were written in the 50s and 60s on international business issues. And then it is clear that a lot of those business schools in America, the motive for writing cases in international business with information from other countries was to get knowledge to transfer it back to the US to support the internalization of American business abroad. So there are an element of transfer both ways, also when it comes to motives. But let's then keep to this fact that we here see it more as a kind of transfer one way. And when I'm talking about the many global north, is the fact that there are many actors and they may have different motives. The government, the US, for instance, as we said, very simplification, the Cold War, secure the American interest was key motives, which expressed their involvement in Inca and Central America and maybe other places as well. The business schools, they had different motives. They had they were part of this kind of larger understanding of management, but they have also their own tradition. For instance, the business schools, the Harvard Business Schools, were strongly influenced by the idea that executive education was important to create the managerial elite and to the professionalization of management and the separation of ownership and management, and also internationally. And therefore, general management was a kind of key concept. But other school was totally against it. And for instance, just to quote Richard Syed, Syed and March for organization theories and all this, who was then strongly involved in this academicization of business education, that business education should be based on academic principles and not only on general understandings and also scientific method. He was strongly against the fact that in Mexico, that Americans should support the founding of an executive education. Instead of support executive education, we need to have degrees, MBA degrees based on scientific principles, and said that what then the four foundations will do, which cause a lot of harm. So they're very kind of competing models also when it comes to content. And if we then go to outside the US, we see that there are some key actors that haven't been researched so much. For instance, the Administrative Staff College in Hanley, established just after the war, established similar academic staff college in a lot of countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, in the 50s and the 60s in the post-colonial period. Those have been claimed then to be more strongly invited by the scientific management movement or ideas than the American post-war general management thought. And their impact and their meeting with these places is not been studied except for in India, where there's a very good study. And similar, ILO with a headquarters in Geneva is the same, where we now have started to do some research. And the fact is then, when I'm talking to the many global North and global South, is that they met and they cooperate in competition, and sometimes we need that also at the local places, as we see in Argentina. The four foundation could support one view, but it could change and then be in dialogue. And in India, they complained, the ILO people complained that they couldn't sign, the Harvard people wouldn't cooperate with them, and they would just neglect them, and so on. So that's the kind of the meeting place concept. It's also complicated. And then so to understand, to have that kind of thing in the back in your head is that there are different differences. This concept, global North and global South, is complex and includes a lot of variation. Is in a way my first argument. The second argument is then that when it comes to management in the post-war perspective, it's more than general management. I think that we got this illustrated today when we talk about operational research in Peru. We got an example of something that kind of could be interesting to explore more. And there are in a way different perception of what is then included in management. We see that in ILO research that we have done, that there are functional things like marketing, some things that include something related to vocational education as part of the management concept. We know that the scientific management ideas, which basically has been said something that the interworld phenomena was strongly represented in a lot of projects, also in the 50s and 60s, for instance, within the framework of the ILO. Productivity techniques was introduced as part of management, and Norwegian professors that I happen to know were introduced and invited to India to give several courses in the framework of business school on the workers' participation in management. So that shows a variety. And then I'm very interested in one thing, and that is industrial engineering. That's the fact that Carlos de Villa have a degree in industrial engineering is not the only reason for that, but it's one reason. But the fascinating thing that is, if you go into the ILO experts and go to their educational background, they are dominated by people with industrial engineering background in the 50s and 60s. We see that a lot of students who came from the global South to the US to study in the 50s and 60s had a degree in industrial engineering. And in India, for instance, the government pushes very strong efforts to establish, to involve ILO in establishing a National Institute for Training in Industrial Engineering. So this is, I think that to understand the meeting between global North and global South, we also need in a way to see, are there something with the kind of different disciplines that we may have overlooked the nuances between all these differences when we come to see the output. That's my argument. The third thing is that this management program and management executive programs and management training, it's more than top management. It's also a lot of small business and family firms that we see. Typically, the Americans in the beginning especially said that introduce top executive programs like the Harvard Advanced Management Program as the model. And that was in a way received both by success and resistance. Both ILO, which was far away from Harvard Business School in a way, introduced advanced management programs in Israel, Egypt and in India in the 50s and the 60s. And other institutions, business school also introduced top executive programs. But at the same time, there's also resistance and arguments against it. They say that we need more than only the top executive programs. In Central America, which introduced top executive programs, they were clear. We say we also wanted more for owner managers in small. The Indian government and the Indian elite pushed very hard to develop a development center focusing on small firms and family firms in the Indian Institute of Management and Ahmedabad against the first ideas from the north. And we see, so the special question is then, we see there is a push from the south, including this, and one question is then, how did then the global north react? Not that ILO reacted positively in the way, it seems that they reorganized the programs to allow more programs for small family business projects in 64. And we see there are efforts also in the global north, for instance, Stanford, to create more programs on small business. Also because this is a debate that also took place in the global north. But more knowledge about that, I think it's important. The fourth thing I want to mention as an example is this question of agribusiness management. In Central America, and Kai said that, well, if we are going to have a business school here, we need to have agribusiness management in focus. And I did. And they did. And they succeeded well, as far as I can say. In India, the Ministry of Food and Agriculture demanded that agribusiness should be a topic at the Institute of International Management in Japan, which then became a new business school in early 60s. And at that place, the elective course in agribusiness management became so popular in the MBA degree that faculty voted against it because it threatened the other courses because no one wanted to have it. so that and that's understandable, and we know a lot about that. But I think what we know less about is the global north reaction to this. And this is, and we know, for instance, at the Harvard Business School, a lot of people didn't want to have this focus on agribusiness in Central America because this is not our competence, but the majority voted, said yes. But why I think this is interesting here is because, of course, this happened in a period where we also in the global north had a strong interest in kind of agribusiness. The USA had a program in rural leadership. Foundation were involved in agribusiness project in Mexico, and the Philippines, and in India. But I've just started to look into that. There are very few studies seeing how this kind of trend, demand from the south and the interest from the north were mixed in the context of what we can call green revolution management. And I think that could be also an interesting topic to explore in this context. Fifth argument is then related to state business. I think a lot of people here, you know, that in Latin America and a lot of other countries in South America, the public or the state have played a very important role in develop the economy. And it's clear that it's a lot of countries we see that there in new programs that dealt with management from the 50s and 60s. There were representatives and participants from both private and public sector from day one. That was not something that you needed to convince the state and government to be involved in, but it was taken for granted that they should be involved in that. And we see also in the studies in Argentina and India, then there were several management training programs in state-owned companies, and also things. What I find interesting here is that this process of, it's not only in Latin America that you had a lot of state governments or states where the state had a strong position in business. For instance, Norway. Norway is a typical country where the state played an important role in developing industry in the 50s and 60s, state investments and foreign investments, but in different ways, maybe in Latin America. but we didn't have the same logic when it comes to include those people, and being there as you had. Why not? And are these different processes, or are they the same process? I think that's also something that could be explored. Corporate training, means in a global south perspective, both local firms, national firms, but also multinational groups have a lot of those. We know that the ILO missions that did management development programs in Argentina from 60 to 66. There were several corporate training programs, both for Pirelli, Mercedes-Benz, and other firms, Fiat. But we don't know so much what happened within the firms, unfortunately. It has to do with archive, it has to do with capacity and things like that. We know that in Brazil, the Ford Foundation was strongly involved together with MIT to development programs in the Brazilian National Development Bank, but according to Ford Foundation reports, they collapsed because of lack of cultural understanding. There are some studies that are very interesting in this respect, and I think set some kind of research model for good studies. One is a study of how they develop programs and using both American, Indians, and British experts to develop programs for the textiles industry in Ahmedabad. And also a business history journal in Maserati and colleagues in 2018 on how Tata, this huge company, used different providers in developing a corporate program in their companies then in the 50s and 60s. And finally, the question of intermediaries. And I here then define intermediaries as an agent that operates between two partners, for instance, in the global north and the global south. They may act as persons or institutions that act as transfer channels so that different ideas can go both ways. They may act as negotiators. They may also act as knowledge creators by taking knowledge from different partners to create something new, or they may agent for only one partner and maybe their own company, or be accused for being agent for the other partners. I think we go into this process, we see a lot of examples of persons and groups that may be defined as intermediaries. I think that needs to be studied much more. For instance, claimed both by the Ford Foundation and the Harvard Business Schools that the reason for the success of creating INCAE in Central America in the mid-60s was the ability to connect to local business groups. But we don't know so much about the position of this group related to the other groups or the rest of the community. We know that there is a lot of examples of foreign students from the global south that's studied in the global north in this period, taking a PhD degree, very typically, taking an MBA degree. We know that in Argentina now some were sent to MBA to be trained to come back to Argentina, but they didn't come back. A systematic study of those is very important. We know that both Harvard Business School and Stanford Business School, a special program to invite people from the global south to train them to be teacher or professor in business administration. We know the names of this, but it's not been systematically studied. How does they function as intermediaries could be into this. And I'm also thinking about academics and business persons, which has, I call it dual anchoring. I will not say dual nationality, but that's kind of very strong. And one of those is the one of Andrea, my hero, I would say. It's Guillermo, who then had a PhD degree had a first degree from Argentina, yes, then moved to Harvard, have a PhD degree, back and forth, and then became one of the key persons in establishing IDEA in the mid-60s, and then used this opportunity to invite and create editorial board Americans. So being anchored in both things. We have this Gail Oxley, the first professor of international business at Stanford, who was also the man who was active in represented Stanford and created ASEAN when they were created in Peru, who had operated in Peru as a businessman in a multinational for many, many years. And we have the business network in Ahmedan, because the fact is that when the Indian Institute established Ahmedabad, the Ford Foundation and University of California in Los Angeles would have that to be established in Mumbai. But because of people in the business networks in Ahmedabad who were strongly connected to Harvard, they managed to convince the Indian government that they should change it to Ahmedabad. So there are a lot of micro examples of this that played some important role. I think that also require more detail. As my argument is that more systematically micro studies on this within this area here could bring the knowledge about the difference and the similarities and the dialogue between management, the global north and south further. So let me then summarize, try to make some summarize this. First thing I would say, and that's with enormous respect, that a lot of research has been done. It's extremely much good research, but I think that more can be done, both empirically within some fields, and especially more can be done more systematically to try to understand more the dialogue between the global north and the global south, both ways in the future. And one question is because I mentioned some examples of meeting places of how these where ideas and practices and concepts have been exposed. The question is, are these relevant meeting places? Are there others? We know we also should question this. I think the other question is the question about the role and the power balance between actors and the meeting places context. Because in the broad picture, in the macro picture, we have a good picture of the power balance where the United States as a very strong power in the 50s and 60s, maybe came a little bit later with the ideas of Latin America than to Europe in the 50s and 60s. So, but we all know about this kind of the geopolitical power balance. But more in the detail level, when this kind of ideas, theories, practices or manage are in a way constructed based on ideas from both the global north, what are then the power relations and the role of the different actors? I think that's extremely important. And what are then the role of that, what called the educational entrepreneurs who mobilize resources both from the north and the south? I mean, that could be ideas from the north by studying in north or so on. And the south could be, of course, the connections to the business communities. And maybe also to ideas and theories on management in the global south. I think there are several examples from the Brazilian case in that respect. I know from earlier discussion that Carlos, you have been interested in this education entrepreneur concept, and I think it's a concept that we need to, it's very fruitful. And then finally, how should we understand changes? How should we understand the messages from the global north? Are they adopted? Were they adjusted or were they rejected? Keeping, and his colleague, he talked about hybridization, which is a good concept. I also here want to say that Srinivas is an Indian studies in 2012 gives a very good examples of how these processes were adopted or implemented in India, based on a rather good theoretical understanding of the different, how to conceptualize different management ideas. The other thing is where the messages, ideas from the global south were they listened to in the global north. Did they guide any action? Were they adopted? I think maybe to study what happened with this kind of culture business, which was on the agenda both in the global north, could be a topic here. But other idea. I will take one example from my case, and that is that I said Indian Harvard Business School, because Harvard Business, when they established this Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, they want to start executive education, and Harvard Business School wanted to have this kind of advanced management program, a top executive programs only for the top executives. The colleagues in India said that's not the case in India. We need to have a kind of 3-level step. We need to have both top, the middle, and then the third level. And they should be linked together. And they should be offered to the organization and not to the managers. So the organization were only allowed to send people or executive to the real top program if they also sent to the level 2 and 3. And that was to strengthen the organizational culture. The India went to Harvard and said, we want to have this. Harvard said, no, we don't want you to do that. And then the dean, next year, dean from Harvard Business School went to India and he joined the classes for 2 years. 2 weeks, 2 days, sorry, jet lag. And he, after the meeting, said, this is an excellent idea. It's a good innovation. It needs to be exported to the world. I don't think it was imported, but it should be very interesting to follow up because it says something about the dynamic. The thing is that what kind of knowledge came out of the meetings, also in the global north, how were the practical examples? Were there kind of new concepts, new categories, or did they contribute to refine new theories? The journal Organization had a special issue in 2012 raising this kind of question, which is a very good start, but I think more has to be done here. Or could it be so that this contact with the global south were only or basically used to legitimize academics' positions in the global north? When we see in the creation of the IB, International Business as a Discipline, in the 60s, that it's clear that a lot of business schools and a lot of professors use their contact in the global south, writing cases to legitimize the new disciplines so that it would be accepted by the rest of the discipline. I don't know. But anyway, that was what I planned to say, and thank you.
Thank you. What a fantastic presentation. Fantastic. So many things. Right. It's like a whole agenda. I don't know how many years. We have 2 PhD students here, so probably. So I know that we are behind the schedule, but if you would like to have any questions, at least we have 10-15 minutes before our lunch break. I don't know, any reaction, comments? Those who are in Zoom, los que están en el Zoom y quieran preguntar, Spanish, English, both languages. I have reaction, as I said, many things, but the last point that you made, because there's a very concrete sort of material, because we have talking about ideas and people, etc., but a lot of money has been moving around all these issues, creating not only administration, public and private. So I think I would try to, I don't know, measure, but as you said, there's a lot of money going around the world to support of these initiatives, not only from the state in the global north, also in the global south, as I said. And I'm curious if you would like to also raise that question about the materiality, or thinking of management education as a business. As you have said, not only in terms of academics or terms of productivity, also because I've done some research about public administration, and there's a lot of concern in the 70s are criticizing a lot about this transfer, and they are saying that the problem is a lot of people are used to become, this is a lot of professions that people have been living 20 years from different, they are used to have this huge practice. So that's what was my question. What about thinking also in terms of materiality as a capitalist enterprise? I mean,
well, I think that's an important question. It's a difficult question to discuss, but it's an element of that. Both institutionally, it's important to establish networks. For instance, networks of educational institutions to develop cooperation, but also for the professors. I mean, it said in the 65 that at Harvard, more than 50% of the professors had been abroad teaching. And of course, then you get some extra during summer. I don't know how important it was, but this is an element.
Carlos?
Sí, very interesting. I just will say one thing. Thanks to your presentation, one as an academic is moved in the sense that there are too many things to do research. And in that sense, I am very optimistic. And our group in general, I think that what you said is a lot of research things to do, very concrete, specific things. But the positive thing is this: in front of when you are confronted to such a wide panorama, I would say that in general in Latin America, I have seen many cases in which the academics get paralyzed and don't do anything. I would say that that's not my case. I hope not of my group. But it has been in other cases, in other contexts in Colombia in the past decades. I have met many scholars paralyzed, and they, for one or another reason, they prefer to say, to keep to the very old ideas instead of doing research. And I guess the nice thing of your presentation is that, at least to some of us, the result is very clear. We have to work more, and there are too many things, too many topics that is very positive. But I guess that I am very realistic in that sense, that is a very time and place constrained thinking. If you go in this same city, maybe in the same university, the reaction is not to do anything. To say, okay, it's great, but not to do anything. Fortunately, in the afternoon, I can give some examples, but it's very positive that coming from very different countries, from the south and the north, I guess we coincide in the very specific list of topics. Very many.
A compliment here. Is that because of funding? What about funding for research in
Exactly. Sergio Wanderley and Luis. Sergio, you will raise your hand and then.
Yes. I know you're all hungry. I had lunch at the first break because I'm 2 hours ahead.
I see why.
Good for you.
So I go for a quick one. Thank you very much, Rolf, for a very inspiring speech. And as Andrea said, I think we have a full agenda there to follow. So I think it was very interesting the way you put this encounter, Global South and Global North. But I think what we are doing here today is where Global South meets Global South. I think I learned a lot from the previous panels, and I think that maybe we could start by putting together some of our ideas and from there to theorize from our local empirical background using local authors, concepts, and themes. And that's going to be my speech later on after Carlos. So thank you very much and for putting this agenda out for us.
Gracias, Sergio. Thank you, Sergio.
Thank
Luis?
you. Well, maybe it was connected to what Sergio sort of mentioned. I think your approach is very fruitful in terms of seeing the dialogue between Global North and Global South and thinking about places, thinking about ideas flowing backwards and forwards. But I was thinking after the end of the Cold War, right? How is this shift between Global North and South affecting these relationships? I'm thinking, for instance, about China, and you think about capitalist development in the Chinese model, right? So obviously there's this big influence of US business schools, right? Harvard, MIT. But now I think that development is taught in different ways. Modernization theory has been criticized, right? So I was thinking, how can this approach also incorporate dialogue and interactions between, as Sergio was mentioning, South and South. I see. I'm thinking also but I don't know, in terms of politics. I don't know. Colombian politicians used to look to what was happening in Mexico in the 1930s,
Exactly.
rather than maybe Europe, right? Because of what was happening. So right now, I wanted to
South meets South.
see exactly.
Exactly.
If I can give some comments to that, I would say that I was not meant as a long list for what should be done, because that's almost an example of what should be done. I personally, I do not plan to do all of this, but for more some idea what can be do. I think generally it's so that when it comes to funding and things like, it's always possibility if you have a good idea for funding something, or sometimes you get few dollars and you can do a few things, something you get more, but that's another thing. But it's something that could be, and this is something that is discussed in the kind of more broader discussions. And I totally agree with you, Sergio, on this, the need for theorization on this, but I didn't want to talk about it because you are coming to talk about it and you are an expert on that. But I think but that's an example. I mean, what has been produced in Brazil and also in India on this kind of management related to concepts such as the global south and decolonization and decolonization, yes, and post-colonization are examples of new ideas coming from India, Brazil, the global south, that in a way create a good dialogue. We have, I think, when it comes to practice, we have very good examples from the 80s when even the American industry started to look to Japan to introduce their practices. So, of course, Japan is maybe not the global south, but it's up and so on and so on. So in that way, it could be something that, but of course, it challenged and I think that's including in the theoretical work that is done in, I said Brazil to just mention all in one group. I know that you are in person on understanding what is coming, but also to understanding how the reaction and how the work is in the global north related. That's I find that a kind of gap when it comes to possible research on it.
I think Rory Miller has raised his hand. Rory, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'd already got Japan in my mind, Rolf, and you just mentioned it, because it seemed to me your first slide very much reflected American modernization theory and self-confidence in the early 1960s. And by the time you get to 20 years later, Japan is challenging American dominance, if you like, of management techniques, with various new management techniques, total quality control, just-in-time management. And I'm wondering, about the extent to which American business schools feel challenged to take on the example of Japan. But secondly, and this is for Latin American colleagues, the extent to which business schools, business management schools in Latin America took on the example of Japan with large business groups and a strong state in terms of industrial development. In other words, for the Latin American colleagues, did Japan make its way into curriculum or not?
I don't know about Latin America about that, so I'm sorry I can't.
Carlos?
But it's a very good question, and we know that U.S. Japan, the Japanese idea was strongly reflected in textbooks and so on. But I mean, the micro studies of how this was reflected in the different discipline, that's also very interesting topic.
Yes, I guess probably that for during the 80s, basically, the Japanese model became quite important as a thing to study in this school. Okay. In fact, one of our former members, who was at the time making a postdoc or something like that in Harvard, Enrique Ogliasli, during his stay at Harvard, he came to Bogota to give a course or two courses twice on the management in Japan as an example. But the point is that lasted, let's say, for 4 to 5 years. But after 1990, everybody will forget about this. So at this time, I guess if you, in this very specific school, you look at the curriculum, which is your question, people say, what are you talking about, Japan? So a very short thing, very interesting to see very specific cases like this. And Japanese nationals in Colombia play some role. At that time and now are very important. But nobody pays any. We maybe in our doctoral program, we read Zalesnik, and people realize that Japan was important, but in the whole idea of the course, that is forgotten. People don't see how Zalesnik was very important, because at the time, the example for American managers, the example to follow was Japan. But we don't. I guess it's a very good point.
It's a very good point, Rory. So I think it's in Bogota, it's lunch time. So we'll have a break for lunch, and we'll be back 2:30 for the two very important presentations, Carlos Avila and Sergio Vanderlei from Brazil, Colombia and Brazil, who are still missing. Thank you again. And we'll be back 2:30 p.m. Bogota local time. See you later. Bye-bye.